News Central now at this hour begins in West Africa, where the Nigerian Senate has increased the 2024 budget by a total of 1.2 trillion naira, moving the budget from 27.5 trillion naira to 28.7 trillion naira. According to the report submitted by the Appropriation Committee led by Senator Solomon Adeola, aggregate expenditure was pegged at 28.7 trillion naira, statutory transfers 1.7 trillion naira, recurrent expenditure 8.7 trillion naira, capital expenditure 9.9 trillion naira, and gross domestic product at 3.88%. President Bola Tinubu had on November 29 presented a total of 27.5 trillion naira budget proposal to a joint session of the National Assembly. The president pegged the budget deficit for the 2024 fiscal year at 9.18 trillion naira, stating that the deficit represents 3.88% of Nigeria's GDP. To discuss this, we are being joined by Paul Alaje, who is an economist. Paul, thank you so much for talking to us.
Yeah, thank you so very much for having me. Compliment of the season.
Same to you. What are the primary factors or areas where the additional 1.2 trillion naira has been allocated in the increased budget by the Nigerian Senate, and how might these allocations impact the country's economic outlook and development priorities?
Well, the Nigerian Senate, like a few other Senate around the world, have the power of long pause. What that means is that the Senate could increase, could reduce the budget submitted by the executive. And this is same with the subnationals, that is, the other 36 states House of Assembly around Nigeria. So when Senate considered that it's important for figures to be increased, or I've seen errors in what have been submitted by the executive, this is their turn to adjust. They could also consider that perhaps it is possible to increase some of the items that government have proposed. It could also be that some persons working in the executive are seeing the need to adjust what they are previously presented. They can also run to the Senate in that joint committee to unanimously adjust. Now, one may wonder that the little time after which the budget was submitted, was presented by Mr. President, if it was sufficient for proper defense to happen. Well, that's another kettle of fish. If truly the Senate, now while we wait for the House of Representatives to see whether they are passing or not, have dotted the I's and crossed the T's, I think we will only wait for time to tell.
So when you now look at the appropriations, we're looking at the aggregate expenditure pegged at 28.7 trillion naira, statutory transfers 1.7 trillion naira, recurrent expenditure 8.7, capital expenditure 9.9 trillion naira. So when you look at those areas where these figures are being pegged, what economic direction do you think this dispensation is looking towards?
Well, I can tell you that this dispensation seems to allocate a bit in terms of percentage to capital expenditure at 9.9 trillion naira compared to the overall function, overall budget, the overall expenditure. CapEx is now taking, I think, around 34%, unlike what was the average of 28 to 30%. So it's a bit higher. We still need to push further to the realm of 50% or 60% of capital expenditure. Significant amount is still going to debt service, even though with the reduction in amount government pay for subsidy or elimination of subsidy technically, as well as what government pays in terms of, what's it called now, recurrent expenditure. We have seen that overhead will take so much, recurrent expenditure, overhead component of current expenditure will take a lot, and we have also seen that service will take a lot. These are two key things. When you look at what you projected on your screen, for instance, the screen reveal that of this total amount, statutory is taking 1.7, debt service is taking a whopping amount of 8.2, while recurrent is at 8.7. When you put those three together, they are all recurrent. Whether you call it recurrent, you call it debt service, part of recurrent because it's not capital. Also, statutory is also part of recurrent. When you put those three together against capital expenditure, you know that to a large extent, the country is still large. And you have seen debt service is now pegged at a 9.1 trillion naira. When you had that to over 87 trillion or so that we are currently owing, one thing may be certain: by the end of next year, Nigeria may cross the boundary of 100 trillion naira debt profile. This is the reality of what we will be seeing by this time next year. But what we need to wait and see is if we would have invested sufficient capital to allow us to pay this so much debt that we have this moment today.
So what about the difference in terms of budget deficits that we have now? How do you think that the government will be able to bridge that gap? We're looking at 9.18 trillion naira in terms of deficits. Of course, before now, there have been talks about how the government will be able to raise revenue, looking at the economic hardship and the challenges that it's faced with. We are not too sure if investors will be willing to put their money into the Nigerian economy, and other sectors are yet to really pick up. So how do you think that deficit will be bridged?
Well, the good news is that some investors still prefer the Nigeria option. And even though there were toll gates that were hindering some of these investors, we are happy to state that government currently is taking ownership of the process by wooing the investors directly into the country. Because having traveled around the world, President Tinubu is trying to see how to woo investors. Only for those that are around, or they want to come willingly on their own, for some persons to have special interest in putting a lot of load on the kind of investment they are bringing to the country. But that is now changing, as we have seen the effort of government in doing this. How do we close the gap of debt? That's huge. Because to close the gap, when we're already using 98% of our revenue to service debt, not my words, according to the Minister of Finance, about 6-7 weeks ago, that we are spending 98% of our revenue. So that will still be huge, in the coming period. Even though we have removed subsidy, we have devalued the naira, it's still a difficult task. How do we therefore say that we should raise revenue in an economy where poverty is still reigning supreme, in an economy where people are not making so much income? Professionals and artisans are suffering together. So in raising revenue in such environment, government, we have to become more innovative. My doubt, it's about raising revenue, humongous amounts that government is projecting at over 18 trillion naira for 18 trillion naira for 2024. So that may be a bit difficult. And if government does achieve this, two things are likely to happen. Neglect part of capital expenditure. If you must fix capital expenditure, then we have to go a borrowing in the same market. And if you go the option of borrowing, then there is another challenge. By 2025, I'm sorry, we may have to borrow to service debt.
Now, considering the GDP growth projection of 3.88% for the 2024 fiscal year stated in a budget report, what are the key challenges and opportunities that Nigeria might face in achieving this growth target, particularly in the context of the revised budget and, of course, the country's economic trajectory?
Well, we need to wait for the House of Representatives to see if they are aligned with their Senate counterparts. If they do, then we'll know that this will be a final revised budget. And hopefully, Mr. President, we are almost convinced that we will not waste time to ascend his signature to make this budget the final one that should not become an act. But now that it's still a bill, we are hoping that the House of Representatives will do the needful, if possible, or they still have time to consult their team so that they can do the due process. So I haven't looked at the process carefully and thoroughly. I can tell you that with the budget and looking at the parameters that is set by there are a number of challenges and there are few opportunities. There are opportunities in sectors that have been projected by the Bureau of Statistics, which includes but not limited to agriculture, telecom, banking, and also mineral resources. Mineral resources is a major opportunity for us to do away with borrowing or to reduce the borrowing figure we have by nearly 50%. That is, to have less than 5 trillion naira borrowing. If we will do more in terms of revenue that will come from some of those sectors I've mentioned, especially the one for mineral resources, minerals and steel. And I must add the last one to it, which is blue ocean economy. We understand that government has separated it from the Ministry of Transport. We are hoping that we will see new energy coming from the supervising minister, and we're going to see a major growth coming on from that ministry. What are the challenges? Enormous challenges. Government is looking at 21% inflation rate. Recall that we are now close to 30%. I think we are now above 28%. We started the year with 21%. Government is hoping that by the end of next year, would have reversed to the end of 2022. Meanwhile, 2023 has really been on high. Recall that the target of central bank is to have inflation between 6 to 9%. That means government do not hope that we're going to get to the ideal situation in the short run. Maybe in medium term, on the long term, we will get to that ideal situation. Government is also projecting that crude oil will sustain rates. That one we have to be very hopeful because anything can happen. The market is so volatile. Nigeria alone cannot decide what happened in that market. We're also hoping that commodity prices will remain the same. I can tell you that volatility of that market is dangerous for us to make such assumption. Government is hoping that all this revenue will go straight into the federation account, and the portion that belongs to federal government will all work. Most of the time, I can tell you, over 75% of the time, it has not been like that.
Paul Alaji, thank you so much for your contributions.
Thank you so very much for having me.